At its peak, the British Empire ruled over nearly a quarter of the world's population, about 458 million people, and stretched across 13 million square miles of territory. That's more land than the moon's visible surface. They controlled everything from Canada to India, Australia to Kenya, and the oceans in between. The empire was so vast that it was said the sun never sets on the British Empire. But how did an island in the North Atlantic manage to dominate the world? And more importantly, how did it all fall apart? This is the story of daring adventurers, brutal colonizers, enlightened reformers, and freedom fighters. It's a tale of steamships and sugar, railways and revolts. The British Empire changed the world, but it couldn't hold it forever. Join us as we uncover how a global titan rose to unmatched heights and how, step by step, it crumbled into history. How a tiny island ruled the world. To understand Britain's rise, you need to picture Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain and Portugal were the big dogs, sailing around the world, colonizing the Americas, and hoarding gold. Britain? A rainy island with shaky politics and a powerful navy in the making. It all began with trade. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the East India Company, which started as a merchant group trading in spices. It would become a private army with over 250,000 troops by the 18th century, twice the size of the British Army itself at times. The company conquered, governed, and taxed much of India long before Britain officially did. Then came the colonies, the 13 American colonies, parts of the Caribbean, and coastal Africa. Sugar plantations in Jamaica and Barbados churned out wealth using enslaved Africans, laying the foundation for Britain's vast global economy. London banks became rich. Liverpool and Bristol thrived. Ships brought goods and slaves across the Atlantic in what became the triangular trade. The 18th century brought wars, and Britain kept winning. In the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain defeated France, gaining Canada and establishing dominance over French territories in India. It became the world's dominant naval power, a title it would hold for over a century. The American Revolution in 1776 was a loss, yes, but the empire pivoted. Instead of just the Atlantic, Britain turned toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. By the 1800s, it ruled India, controlled Australia, and carved out huge swaths of Africa. Entered the Industrial Revolution. Coal, steam engines, and factories turned Britain into a global production powerhouse. Textiles, steel, and weapons were made cheaply and exported across the globe. Railroads and telegraphs followed the empire like the roots of a tree. Colonies weren't just subjects, they were markets and mines. By 1913, the British Empire reached its maximum size, 26% of the world's population and 24% of Earth's land area. It had over 400 million people under its rule. It built schools, railways, ports, and parliaments, but also exploited land, erased cultures, and imposed English control over ancient civilizations. Some called it a civilizing mission. Others saw it as oppression in uniform. Still, the empire seemed unstoppable until the cracks began to show. The cracks beneath the surface. The British Empire was a marvel of control, but control always comes at a cost. Beneath the grandeur of red-coated governors and sunlit colonies lay cracks, fractures formed by resistance, resentment, and rebellion. And those cracks were growing wider. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, long before decolonization took center stage, people under British rule were beginning to push back. They resisted not just with swords and muskets, but with memory, language, and quiet refusal. Take India in 1857, known in Britain as the Sepoy Mutiny, but in India rightfully remembered as the First War of Independence. It wasn't just about cartridges greased with animal fat. Indian soldiers in the British East India Company Army rose up against a system that disrespected their culture, their faith, and their people. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Cities were taken. British families fled or were killed. Eventually, the empire crushed the revolt with brutal force. But something irreversible had happened. The British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control. Empire had become empire in full. Jamaica saw its own reckoning in 1865 with the Morant Bay Rebellion. Former slaves, promised land and equality, found themselves still stuck in poverty and injustice. When they protested, the governor unleashed a wave of executions so ruthlessly that it sparked outrage back in Britain itself. Control was slipping, and the backlash was louder. In Africa, opposition simmered. In Kenya, early Kikuyu resistance began to stir even before the famed Mau Mau uprising. In southern Africa, the Zulu resisted wave after wave of British encroachment. Farther north in Sudan, the Mahdist revolt in the 1880s nearly ousted British forces entirely. The empire wasn't rolling over continents, it was stomping, and the earth was starting to stomp back. Then there was Ireland, a colony hidden in plain sight. Centuries of repression had turned bitterness into identity. During the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, over 1 million Irish died and 2 million emigrated. British policies, like continued grain exports during the famine, only deepened Irish rage. Ireland wasn't just hungry, it was angry. Meanwhile, back in Britain, cracks were forming in the ideology too. Enlightenment thinkers like John Stuart Mill began to ask, could a nation that preached liberty really justify owning half the globe? The answer was getting harder to stomach. And yet, the empire kept expanding. In 1884 to 1885, the Berlin Conference took place. Picture it. European powers gathered in a gilded room, carving up Africa like a birthday cake, with not a single African at the table. Although Britain already controlled key regions like Egypt and South Africa before the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, the agreements established there accelerated British expansion. In the decades that followed, Britain established control over large swaths of Africa, including Nigeria, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and Rhodesia. By the early 20th century, Britain governed more than 30% of Africa's population, making it the continent's most populous colonial power. In Australia, indigenous people were pushed to the margins, often killed or displaced under policies of terra nullius, the belief that no one had truly owned the land before colonists arrived. In New Zealand, the Maori fought to hold their ground during the brutal land wars of the mid-1800s. The British civilizing mission brought railroads and schools, yes, but also disease, dispossession, and loss. But colonized people weren't just resisting with weapons, they were organizing. In India, Dadabhai Naoroji became the first Indian elected to British Parliament. Bal Gangadhar Tilak declared, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." These weren't fringe voices, they were the beginning of something enormous. In West Africa, intellectuals in Ghana and Nigeria began writing in English, but about African stories. In the Caribbean, poets and preachers reclaimed folklore, spirituality, and rhythm. Identity was rising as a force of rebellion. It wasn't just about throwing out the British, it was about finding what it meant to be not British. Cultural resistance mattered, and it was the start of a storm. The British Empire seemed unstoppable, its map endlessly red. But in every colony, the seeds of resistance had already been sown. Quiet at first, but growing louder. The 20th century loomed, and with it, everything would change. Wars that broke the empire. If the 19th century was the age of imperial expansion, the 20th was the age of reckoning. And that reckoning came wrapped in smoke, fire, and the thunder of global war. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was a turning point. Britain called on its empire, and the empire answered. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served. Troops from Nigeria, Kenya, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Caribbean fought and died in muddy trenches far from home. It was, for many, their first taste of Mother England. But it wasn't sweet. Those who returned home brought not just physical scars, but deep questions. What were we fighting for? Freedom? Whose freedom? They had bled for an empire that wouldn't grant them basic rights. In India, the nationalist movement gathered speed. Mahatma Gandhi, once a lawyer in South Africa, emerged as a leader of breathtaking moral force. His tactics of nonviolent resistance were new, powerful, and infuriating to the British. In 1919, a peaceful protest in Amritsar ended in horror when British troops opened fire on a crowd of unarmed civilians, killing at least 379. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre sent shockwaves across India and across the world. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 was crushed in days, but the British overreaction, executing leaders and imprisoning thousands, backfired. By 1921, Ireland was partitioned. The South became the Irish Free State. Northern Ireland remained with the UK. The empire, for the first time, had lost a piece of its own home. And then came World War II. From 1939 to 1945, the empire once again stood on the brink. Again, the colonies stepped up. India sent 2.5 million soldiers, the largest voluntary army in world history. African, Caribbean, and Canadian troops fought bravely. Britain was never alone, but it was becoming increasingly indebted. By the war's end, London was bombed, rationing was still in place, and Britain owed billions to the United States. The empire, once self-funding, now ran on loans and American goodwill. Something had shifted. The moral high ground Britain once claimed, the great civilizer, the world's schoolteacher, was eroding. Colonized people had seen white men bleed and die, just like anyone else. They had seen hypocrisy in British ideals, and they had seen opportunity. The United Nations was formed in 1945, promoting self-determination. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt had made it clear, colonialism had to go. Even Britain's closest allies were now quietly urging decolonization. And then came India. On August 15, 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. The subcontinent was split along religious lines. It was a moment of triumph and tragedy. Between 12 and 20 million people were displaced. More than 1 million died in ethnic violence. Train cars arrived at stations filled with corpses. The price of freedom had never been higher. India's independence was the symbolic collapse of the empire. If the crown jewel could leave, so could everyone else. In the next 2 decades, Britain's colonies began slipping away like sand through fingers. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. The Caribbean began gaining independence island by island. And this wasn't just retreat, it was reckoning. In places like Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising revealed dark truths. British colonial forces used detention camps, torture, and executions to repress rebellion. Years later, survivors would win lawsuits against the British government, forcing the empire to finally confront its past. Even back home, the British public began to shift. War fatigue, economic strain, and changing values led to a growing sense that the empire was no longer glorious. It was outdated. The empire wasn't just crumbling, it was being questioned, examined, and finally let go. But the journey wasn't over yet. The winds of change, decolonization, and collapse. After India, the dominoes fell quickly. Ghana became independent in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah, sparking a wave across Africa. Nigeria followed in 1960, and Kenya in 1963, though Kenya's path involved the bloody Mau Mau uprising, where atrocities were committed on both sides. The 1960s were the death knell of the empire. The wind of change, a phrase coined by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, summed it up. He told Parliament that colonial independence was no longer a question of if, but when. The Caribbean followed suit. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gained independence in 1962. Smaller islands would follow in the decades ahead. In Asia, Malaysia declared independence in 1957. Hong Kong, held by Britain since 1842, was handed back to China in 1997, marking one of the final symbolic ends of British colonialism. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had shown just how weak Britain had become. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain tried to seize control, but was forced to back down by pressure from the US and USSR. The message was clear. Britain was no longer a global superpower. The empire was replaced by the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations with historic ties to Britain. Today, 56 countries belong to it, including India, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and many Caribbean nations. But it's symbolic. The days of British imperial rule are over. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II's death marked another chapter's end. Her reign had begun when Britain still held vast colonies. By the time she passed, those colonies had become sovereign nations with their own destinies. Conclusion: the British Empire didn't fall in a single moment. It withered, slowly, steadily, through resistance, reform, and reinvention. From trading posts to global supremacy to post-colonial reckoning, it shaped the modern world in profound ways. Yes, it built railways and institutions, but it also conquered, extracted, and dominated. Some nations emerged stronger, and some still struggle with the scars of colonialism. Languages, borders, and governments across the world still bear the fingerprints of empire. But here's what matters. The empire that once believed it could control the world learned, in the end, that people always want to be free, and they will rise again and again until they are. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the British Empire, check out our book, The British Empire, a captivating guide to the largest empire in history and its impact on the Age of Discovery, transatlantic slave trade, the Americas, India, World War I, and more. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.